tech companies are shifting their focus from growth at all costs to profits and efficiency. One of the biggest challenges for engineers today is knowing where to draw the line. When should you build something robust and scalable? And when should we keep it simple and focus on business impact? In this episode, I talked to David Lamothe, engineer manager at SumUp, one of the largest European payment providers. He leads a team of 15 senior engineers in the platform team. Before SumUp, he was an engineer manager at Shopify and Jimdo based in Hamburg. By the end of this episode, you will learn how technical an engineer manager should be, how to balance business goals with technical requirements, how to keep engineers motivated when promotions and pay raises aren't on the table, and how AI might change the role for engineer managers in the near future. My name is Luis Eduardo, but you can call me Luardo. I'm a software engineer and tech lead based in Berlin. And in this podcast, I talk to engineer leaders about the topics that matter beyond the code. So without any further ado, here's my conversation with David Lamothe. David Lamothe, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So we were talking about just before, then you're originally from Canada. What made you move to Berlin, or what made you move to Hamburg, to work in tech?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always a complicated nuance question, and I get it a lot, but the sort of short of it is, in Canada where I'm from, it's kind of remote. It's far away from a lot of things, and a lot of people tend to stay around that area. So tech is one of the industries where I obviously have the privilege to be able to say, hey, we want to live in another part of the world and work in a different culture. I always appreciate the idea of working in a multicultural environment with different people and challenging myself, the ways of thinking, ways of working, as well as the ways of living. And this also is something that, frankly, is easier to do relatively early in your career where you have less dependencies or what have you. So relatively early on, I made the decision that I was going to apply abroad. To be honest, I didn't target Germany specifically. I applied all over, obviously, for US jobs. There's just a big industry there. But I was more looking towards Europe because of a variety of things. I really appreciated the values and work culture it sort of was projected as having. And now that I'm, here, I can say, it's a very balanced, good place to live. I like that everyone kind of lives on the same plane, so to speak. And Hamburg was sort of just a coincidence. I got an offer from a company. It seemed good, and I took the leap. And I ended up really enjoying it and sticking around for longer than I expected.
Yeah, I mean, you have been working for several years at Jimdo, which is a website builder, also at Shopify, and now you're leading teams as an engineer manager at SumUp. So what has been your experience working at these big companies?
I always like to say that I think every company you work at is a little bit different, regardless of size. So, I mean, I had a really great experience with my time at Jimdo. It was probably the smaller of those three you listed, but I felt like it had a really solid tech culture. You could be fast because people had a lot of autonomy, but we had a pretty, I would say, strong founder-led vision. People were really familial and friendly with each other. It had its ups and downs. I'm not going to say it was a perfect company, but I enjoyed it. And going to Shopify from there, for example, was a completely not opposite, but different experience. It was obviously a much bigger scale. The level of technical complexity I was working on was pretty high, I would say, which I personally enjoyed. I consider myself fairly technical. But also the stakes and the alignment you had to do blew up. You have to work with people all over the world. San Francisco and Quebec were two of the areas where I worked with the most people, I would say. So sometimes I had to jump on a meeting at 9 p.m. And the way we aligned work, I would say, was much more individualistic. You had a lot of individual responsibility. You were expected to produce a document to justify things, and you were expected to carry out based on that. And you were, I would just say expectations were stronger there. But I think each of these was a very good experience where I learned a lot. And now at SumUp, probably closer in size to Shopify, but it's, again, a very different experience. The way I would compare the two is Shopify, insofar as both its architecture, but also its decision-making was pretty centralized. It had a pretty strong core founder-led vision, and that propagated down in a way. SumUp, on the other hand, I would say has a lot of decentralized aspects. It is a global company, much like Shopify was, but the way it has expanded was partially due to acquisition, partially just due to new teams formed. The way things were built diverged quite a lot. It wasn't monolithic. It was obviously microservice-based. Shopify is one of the few remaining monolithic applications that got to that scale, I guess. But
okay,
SumUp itself is much more decentralized, a lot of independent decision makings that sometimes lead to, differences between the parts of the products or the way the markets operate pretty heavily.
Interesting. I wouldn't have thought that Shopify still has a monolith, while all the other companies are moving into microservices and trying to make it more distributed. Just out of curiosity, what is the stack of Shopify? Is it built on PHP or something like that, more monolithical, or what?
No. I mean, it's prototypically like with the Ruby on Rails application. I think it's the biggest in the world, and they actually have teams contributing to both the core language of Ruby, and they have a separate team contributing to the framework of Rails itself. So, I mean, the founder, Tobias Lütke, is close friends with David Hannemeyer Hansen, who was one of the people developing the the original framework. So they kind of worked hand in hand in the early days of Shopify.
I see. You've said that people want to do great work if you give them the right tools and the right information. What do you mean? And what does that mean in your day-to-day work of giving the right tools to the right people and the right information? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's a hard question and it's a hard problem to solve because what the right tools are might differ from people. But it's primarily like, I believe in a context-driven method of leadership. So instead of, your job as a leader is to really break down individual small chunks of work and to tell people like, this is what you have to do, being kind of the overseer of all the systems and saying it has to happen in this way, in this fashion, in this order. You instead try to give people as much context, both on the technical side, hey, how do these systems work on the high level? Why were these made? But also on the product side, because ultimately the best work comes when there's like sort of the stitching between what the product is and what the engineering that reflects it is. You can't really have one without the other. And in order to do this, there's a variety of ways. There's this old like management adage about 7 and 7, where you have to communicate things in 7 different ways, 7 times to actually get something to stick. So it might be you write a document sometimes. You'll also bring those discussions to some group discussions and have brainstormings. Maybe you'll have one-on-ones where you align people on some specific topics they have to go towards. Maybe you'll also, do presentations on different ideas. It's really varied by context. I am a big believer in like starting any given project with a document that gives you sort of the high-level vision of it with some of the details of the how, without going into like the fine-grained details of, hey, this is the specific database design we want to use or something, unless it's a very data-oriented problem. And maybe you want to do that up front.
Yeah, I can imagine that in large companies such as like Shopify or SumUp, you have like different feature teams or even a platform teams, and the specific goals or metrics from each teams are very hard to see them in the big picture. So sometimes if every team can see what's the main goal of doing this kind of projects, what are the big impact in the business, maybe give them a bit more of the clarity of why we're doing that and where do we want to go and what's the best way to build it. Because sometimes developers, they get the small context and then they want to build something with the latest technology and the mostly, or sometimes like over-engineer solutions because sometimes they don't understand what's the outcome that is expected for the business. So while you give them more context, they can see, okay, do we need to build something very robust or we just need to go more pragmatic for the solution?
Yeah, I would say that's actually one of the biggest things I always push against, because every engineer you work with wants to work on whatever their specific ecosystem's latest thing is. And, by now in my career, I've worked pretty far across the stack. I was involved in some early, like, let's say, Kubernetes setup and doing DevOps for the team at the time. By now, I'm pretty, rudimentary knowledge in that field, I would say, but I've done backend, I've done front end. I have tended to adapt my engineering style to the specific problem. And by and large, those large-scale migrations you see to a tech X or Y are for reasons that I think, in retrospect, are not justified. I think the front-end community is notorious for this, obviously, where new frameworks pop up pretty regularly, though I think it's been pretty stable for a long time. And I think backend in some ways is not any better. I've been to a few organizations where they migrated from language X to language Y, and they had some loose justification, but it doesn't always hold out. Like, the level of scalability is better in this language, but how many of your systems are actually scaling to the volume where language is a limitation? Actually, Shopify is a good counterexample of this, where it's one of the largest Ruby on Rails applications in the world, a notoriously relatively poorly performing language, and it's working at scale that most companies would dream of.
Yeah, I've seen when Go became more popular, a lot of teams companies starting to migrate everything to Go because they said it's faster. But is it faster than spending 1.5 years developing the new stack or not? For me, that was always like the question. You're going to take you 1.5 years or 2 years to rebuild everything. Does that justify the change?
Yeah, and I've SumUp is now on Go, so I know that specific shift as well. I think Go specifically, and this is the funny thing you'll also see, I've observed cities have sort of cultures behind languages, and I feel like in Berlin especially, a lot of the companies adopted Go. Maybe they were learning from each other to a degree. But for example, I talked to someone in our San Francisco office who was pretty adamantly opposed to it because he said it's hard to hire for Go in their area. Yeah. And so there's a lot of factors you have to consider when you pick a tech stack like this.
Yeah, true. And now that you said that you were touching a lot of points in the infrastructure and also back end and front end, but now you're more in the leadership role. So now you see everything more like in a high level or mentoring other team members. But you're also a leader who believes that you should stay close to the technical work. How technical should you be as an engineer manager?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all answer to that question. I do think at my current point, I'm probably the least technical I've been, which is natural as you progress as an engineering manager. I've been managing teams for about 6 years, I guess. And at first, my first team obviously was a very small team that I was at the time kind of the tech lead of. So I was responsible for making the technical decisions. And when I became manager, it's not like we added new engineers to backfill me. So I by nature still remain hands-on. I was just more formally someone who was making the decisions and dealing with some stakeholder aspects. As you grow as a manager over time, maybe you get more reports, maybe you get more context. And maybe for context in my current situation, I'm managing about 15 engineers right now across 3 teams. And in this context, it becomes a little harder, obviously, because the managerial aspect becomes more intensive. That being said, I still try to remain as hands-on as possible. One thing I really believe in is as a manager, your work is inherently sort of spread out. You're dealing with a lot of context, a lot of, different ideas, and you're trying to narrow them down so that people who are going to work at them in depth can focus on them and do a good job on them. So in that narrowing down phase, I will often look through the code, maybe check out some PRs if we're integrating with other systems, try to understand them, look at API specs, whatever. And I'll, hand the context I have over to the engineer and talk it through with them, bounce some ideas back and forth and give them a kickstart. And then in addition to that, where I'm treating the engineers as experts on the topic, I will pick up PRs, small tasks, things around the edges that maybe we need to do that I would perceive as a distraction to the engineers who are doing more focused work. Most of the code I ship nowadays is on the non-critical path, I would argue, or it's like small things in the case of an incident or something that pops up that I need to fix in a pinch. But I try not to be the person who is implementing a feature end-to-end as much. The caveat to this is I still occasionally try to join in on hacking exercises. We have hack weeks, we have hack days every other week where we can focus on stuff. And I try to work on building little solutions on occasion, which accelerates something around the edge. So I think these are some ways you can remain hands-on to a degree. Again, it's pretty context dependent, but what you don't want is to treat engineering managers as pure people managers. Because at the end of the day, you can't give your engineers good guidance on how to improve if you don't understand the nature of what the work they do is. And the further you get away from this, you won't be a good sparring partner. You won't be someone who can give them good advice outside of very generic, hey, you should write more tests. Hey, you should write more documentation. The more nuanced, what you did here, maybe you could approach this problem a different way if you think about it this way. Implementations engineers really value, and I think they help grow them quite a lot.
And you enjoy more those kind of tasks, like guiding them and how to implement a solution and not being the one writing the code? Or was it hard for you at the beginning to let off the code and starting to think or starting to program, let's say, by talking to others, like designing the solution by just words with other engineers?
It definitely is hard at first. I think the hardest job actually in this regard is the first one you get, which will in most cases be within the company you're already at. So you're a senior engineer on a team, then you're asked to step up to be a manager. In this case, you already have sort of ownership over that code and you feel attachment to it because of that. You want to make sure it goes in the direction you're already setting out for it. Where it became a lot easier for me, to be honest, was where I switched jobs and I jumped into a code base that was maybe already big, a lot of decisions made, and you can't just turn back the clock on that. So you end up having to build relationships with people you trust that are, deep into that code. Maybe you take some small ownership over pieces of it that you want to drive forward and have opinions on. But it's not like you're precious over every little element of it. And this can happen with an organization too, if you are in a situation, for example, where there's a restructuring or you're asked to work on a new system. But I think, the quicker an engineer learns to not feel personal attachment to whatever system they've worked the longest on, the better. You do experience this occasionally where you find an organization where there's an engineer that's worked on one system for 10 to 15 years. Giving any kind of feedback on those systems tends to be the hardest, and they tend to be the ones that are the most, let's say, stuck and can lead to issues with organizational shifts around them.
How does day-to-day look like for you as an engineer manager at SumUp? What kind of things are you working on? How does it look?
Again, it's a complicated question because in my area of SumUp is, I think, unique in the manager world. So I'm in the platform tribe, and platform itself is kind of a loaded term. A lot of people assume it means infrastructure. In the case of what I work on, I would say I focus more heavily on the CRM side, which in the platform sense means we work with a lot of external vendor tooling in order to do our CRM functions. This is the typical Salesforce suite. And then we have a series of services on top of that facilitate the processes of CRM internally. This both includes back office tooling, your typical internal front ends that teams build out for their functions, but it also includes things like data pipeline solutions that allow you to bring data to our different CRM solutions that sort of integrate into our business flow processes. In addition to sort of this context, I have adjacently a communication platform where you're working on the marketing messaging, but also transactional messaging for people. So a lot of my day-to-day, again, is across this relatively broad, important scope to the organization and its success. And it's really like, I have a lot of alignment meetings by now, understanding like what the global priorities are, bringing them down to these individual teams and making people understand how we're going to translate this into work that unlocks capabilities. As is, I guess, also the case in the modern environment, I would say all of the teams here are kind of small compared to what they would be in the past. So there's an attitude, and this is one of SumUp's values, do more with less. And you basically end up in a state where you really have to figure out what's the most impactful thing you can do, because these spaces always have a long list of things that people would like to happen, but you only have finite time of what you can do. So getting into the weeds of like, how people use this, how people are using our current systems, checking the data, validating what our most important business priorities are, and then prototyping how we can get let's say, I don't want to say low effort, but like a version of what can really empower the business in a relatively short time span is an important part of my work, I think.
Now that you mentioned a little bit of efficiency, and one of your recent talks on Lead Dev Conf, you talk a little bit that companies are moving into fast growth, focusing on profit and efficiency. What changes did you have to make as a leader because of that?
Yeah, so the biggest change I think here is like a shift in mindset with people. So it's really like this aspect of how you are used to working. The first thing I often actually do when I come to teams is like I try to strip out processes, because to me, like, process is like a necessary evil of collaborating with people, but the most you can remove it, the more time you have on actually building what you want. This is what I was mentioning earlier with high context work. So if you come to a team and they have a lot of rituals and they're spending far too long debating about what the right definition of a ticket is, these conversations are always exhausting, and you realize like no one's really enjoying it. So if you have frank conversations with them and say, hey guys, like, let's focus on what the important thing we're trying to do is, let's give people the space to do it, and let's put trust in people so that they can execute on it, instead of having to say, hey, your job is to scale and, grow more people, which is maybe the case in good times. When you want to expand teams, you say, let's focus on making sure we can onboard as many people as fast as possible. You really say, hey, how can we really do the most precise things that provide high impact? Like, let's look for angles, a lot of lateral thinking, right? You say, we have these 5 big things. You don't say, we're going to do all these things. You say, what's the most important one we can do reasonably? There's simple mechanisms towards doing this. I like doing stuff like a matrix between complexity and impact, so that like what are the least complex things that have the highest impact. Maybe you do a few of those. And then the complex things that also have high impact, you should have as bets. So you should always have a parallel of things that are basically, this is the thing we want to do in the short term to be impactful. This is the bigger initiative we want to do in the long term to be impactful. And yeah, it's also a bit about trying to encourage people to stretch beyond their boundaries. I think one thing that happened again during the more calm period in the industry is you end up in a lot of subdivisions in certain parts of the industry where very fine-grained specialization comes up. Many people have heard the terms like front end of front end and back end of front end, which is true. Some people are really strong at like HTML, CSS and really making amazing web designs, and some people are better at like writing the JavaScript that powers complex SPAs. And in some contexts, this is necessary. In some contexts, depending on how complex those front ends are, you might need to just say, hey, you guys are back-end engineers, but we have to make a basic, UI for this in order to enable business users to use it or something like that. And it's about sort of avoiding this idea that engineers should limit the box of the types of work they can do. Obviously, this is within reason. Like we can't just ask, an engineer to suddenly be an HR person. But I think this idea of there being classes of engineering that are sort of exclusive will change with time.
Especially with AI, I imagine, right?
Yeah, that's a little bit of the elephant in the room that I was avoiding using the word, but this is an aspect of it too. There are aspects of AI certainly has shown capabilities to do some types of work very well and very efficiently. I don't think it's quite at the point yet where it's solving all the problems or it's going to replace engineers fully, but I think especially if it's like a matter of, hey, we need to make a basic form. This person doesn't know any JavaScript. Generate me a form. It's going to happen in seconds, right? And that's a fine use case, I think. It really empowers people as opposed to needing this complex thing of, we need to borrow this guy from here for an hour to get context on our thing and whip this up.
You mentioned the rule of 40 as a way of measuring success. Can you explain a little bit again what that rule of 40 is?
Yes, this is something we used at SumUp for a while. And I think it's a common metric in SaaS business. So let's say you're a company that is growing slowly, but you're highly profitable. That's probably in a pretty good, healthy state. Think like any of the longer lived, let's say old school businesses. I don't know. Like something like Nintendo comes to mind to me. They're a company that has never like gotten gigantic, but they make tons of money. And then there are companies that grow really fast, but they burn money. I guess I haven't actually looked at recent metrics, but is ChatGPT still burning money? A lot of the big scale-ups are. But, just because they get so much traction, they end up in a state in the future where you can sort of turn that dial and make that into a business that is, huge and sustainable. And that's the basic idea. I think it's an interesting one. And I'm not sure how much it holds in the current environment, because what we saw is like the way the rule of 40 is used is shifting. In the classic like VC funded way, it was like, we don't care about your profitability at all. Let's grow at all costs. And so you kind of balance this out. Now it's sort of shifting more to the middle where, hey, we want to keep growing at like, let's say a rate of 20 or 30%, but we want to maintain that operating like slight profitability or slight deficit to be a little more sustainable. Which honestly, I don't mind the shift of. I think like going all in on one or the other becomes sort of hard for a business to sustain indefinitely, at least.
Yeah, sure. I mean, companies like Uber and a lot of the food delivery companies are still in that process of just burning and trying to move into a little bit more of the efficiency and profitability. And that sometimes challenges the business itself and the project that the engineers are working on, because it's like, is this really necessary for the growth of the business or not? And that enters into that territory. Do you think that engineers should understand the business idea too, this rule of 40?
I mean, I don't want to treat any rule like a gospel. I think it's a little silly to say like this is the absolute metric. I do think engineers should generally understand what the purpose of their product space is. And if it's too indirect from like how the company actually succeeds and thrives, they maybe need to go a layer deeper. And bigger organizations always end up in this problem. Like there's also this mantra of like, you should always be in a profit center, because all bigger businesses have profit centers and cost centers, where some things are just sort of necessary evils you have to pay for, and some are actually like driving the business success. The closer you are to the profit center, the less dispensable you are, to be honest. Like the business is always going to be investing in their profit centers. And it also leads to better work if you actually understand what the outcome is. I've seen too many times in my career, engineers go towards something that from an engineering standpoint is very idealistic and very like pure, let's say, but it fell down in the actual operation of the business. And taking software as this sort of indirection from like human processes is naive. Like software and people inherently have to interlink in order for them to be successful. Software can't exist in this abstract, and engineers need to understand this too.
Yeah, sometimes right now engineers have to work, for example, on fixing old systems or on to reduce complexity, right? How do you help them, for example, in these cases, to feel excited about that kind of work? When it's not about like, I want to build my state-of-the-art system, but maybe they need to work on an old system or to make something less complex. How do you keep them motivated?
I think vision helps with that. It's also like, there's a carrot and a stick approach, I guess. Like you can say you have to do this because it's your job and we're paying you well. That's, that's generally not going to work very well. I think one thing is you should always try to be caring about your engineers and understand that there's always going to be a mix of work that is exciting and work that is sort of necessary. And at least if you can connect the dots between that work that is necessary to the exciting part, it's much easier to justify doing it. Whether it's like, we have a project we're trying to set up for, but it requires migrating this old legacy system here so that we can really start to leverage on the innovation we can build on top of this data or whatever is coming out of it. And by connecting those dots, you basically justify the need for this thing, and it becomes much easier for them to, I think, jump in and do it. And then depending on that legacy stuff, depending on the type of engineer they are, maybe it's like an interesting technical challenge. Some engineers just love sleuthing around and figuring out how old systems work. And maybe it's a matter of like putting the right people to the right problem. It's not like every single person on a team has to be the same person and solve all the same problems. Sometimes you just have to find the right fit to solve that problem.
It's about trying to find the small wins, things that, like as you said before, like things that create big impact when you do what you said, like this matrix of complexity and impact, right? Can you give an example of a small fix that made a big difference in your team or at your organization?
Sometimes it just surprises. I'll give you an example. User access management is something that has been a struggle internally at SumUp. And there was a feature introduced recently where we just allowed people to visualize the access requests they had done. And this was something they could never historically do. It was always historically a human process. So in order to request access to a system, you had to give, a ticket to a department. That department would fulfill it, and then you would get access to the respective systems. And this is something that's sort of invisible toil in an organization where you have a lot of things that are going on, a lot of people trying to get access to different systems, and they don't really know what the status of that stuff is. And just simply taking data that was in our database, visualizing it, and sort of publicizing that was actually received pretty positively. There's a lot of stuff you can do just by understanding where users, I think, are having problems and like visualizing new stuff, having the ability to update something small. And I've seen this time and again in my career.
You said like in our previous LinkedIn chat that we were discussing some of your points of view on some topics. You said that people need to feel like they are growing. How do you help them to how do you have your team to build the skills and stay excited about their future, especially when in many companies right now, there are so many raises or promotions as before?
I always like to have the raise and promotion argument orthogonal to what their growth is, because and I don't like to, this can also be used as a tool for a manager to sort of oppress people. I don't want to say it in that sense. But what I mean is a title and a money you make is not necessarily a pure measure of how you are growing as a person. I think it's always good to reward your engineers to show that you appreciate their work with those sort of extrinsic motivators. But you should also just keep providing them with projects that extend their challenge scope. Make sure that they're not just working on one system their entire time, but they jump into a new system that's a different context, whether it's a different language, a different business context, a different set of stakeholders, anything that puts them a bit outside their comfort zone while learning something new that they are a bit excited about is the most important thing towards growth. And going back to the small wins thing, making sure to do that incrementally, consistently over time. So they're constantly challenging themselves, and challenging behavior sort of becomes a rhythm and a habit, let's say. It's not anything new or exciting. And that should keep people motivated. Now, this isn't to say this is an absolute rule, depending on organizational shifts, depending on a variety of factors. Sometimes you have periods where people are less motivated, the work is less good. It's never going to be a pure all-in answer, but that approach has worked well for me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I don't know, but my experience in software engineering is that people feel excited sometimes when they take more ownership or more responsibility or can take more decisions about the technical path that they are working on. I have a feeling other careers, maybe they focus more on the money or the title. I have the feeling that engineers, they care about a lot about what they're working on. Is that the case in your experience?
I have met a lot of passionate engineers, and I think that is a good thing. I do think it really depends on the type of engineer. So this is where I think the shifts we mentioned earlier with AI become a bit of a challenge to me. I think there's a lot of passionate people in our field, but a lot of them are passionate about fairly specific stuff. And whether that specific stuff is as valued as it was previously might change a bit. But broadly, especially when you go into as you said before, the full stack sphere, you have people who, they really just care about delivering something. This is also how I've always framed my engineering work. I've never really been my career goal. I started in C#. I wasn't I'm going to be the C# person. That's my true passion. My passion was I wanted to make software because it's things people use, and I wanted to make useful things in the world. And you do have this attitude amongst a lot of engineers, especially the ones that I think, let's say the major players in tech tend to hire. I would agree with that statement. There is obviously people that are still motivated by money and people who still only care about the technical side. And I think this is also fine, no judgment on that. But I do really appreciate an engineer who has that passion to actually make something that matters.
Yeah. You say you like to focus on results. How do you decide what outcomes matters the most?
This is a hard question as well. Ideally, you want to be, I don't even want to use the word data driven, because it was funny, when I was at Jimdo, we threw around the word data driven, and everyone obsessed for a while about that.
Became a buzzword.
Yeah, it became a buzzword, but also the data just wasn't that good for some time. So data driven became nearly impossible to achieve, and people ended up being kind of confused on a lot of topics. So, at some point our leadership sort of shifted the messaging towards data informed, which I kind of liked, because at the end of the day, data is only a single input, and it's valuable because it, breaks your own biases. But data can also be used to reinforce your biases. Again, it depends on what data it is, how you're framing it. We've seen this in scientific research, but we can definitely see this in tech companies where the data is even less methodical and structured at times. So first off, you do have to look at the data, usage numbers, understand that aspect. Ideally, some qualitative data, whether it's surveys, research of the users, understanding what the day-to-day problems are, comes into this. And then it's also maybe understanding the organizational direction. Sometimes you make changes not necessarily because, to be frank, it makes I know this on the internal side, it's not necessarily always making the user's journey better, but sometimes it's reducing operational costs. Sometimes it's improving resiliency of systems, which tends to be a sort of invisible toil that people don't measure very well. There's a variety of data inputs you should make towards any decision. You also have to work with your own context. I think if you try to be data driven, you end up in a place where you sort of take the human out of the equation. And I think us as leaders are also responsible to make judgment calls sometimes make, hey, I think this is the best idea based on what I know today. Doesn't mean it's always going to be right, but it cuts through the sort of need to worry about being perfect.
I like that approach, from data driven to data informed. because you still put the human aspect on it. But how do you know when something is working or not? What metrics do you use, or how do you measure the success?
Ideally, you can validate it as soon as possible. So the best way you can see if something's working is to ship a version of it as early as possible. And then from there, I mean, there's a variety of like lagging and leading indicators. Usage rates are a pretty obvious one. If it's something that's user facing and people are going to use it, adoption is a very easy one to measure. Depending on the context, maybe it's like looking at the costs. Depending on other factors, maybe it's like not just how many people are using it, but how much time is spent on it, how much revenue it is generating. If it's a product-facing thing, like sometimes you want a feature that specifically leads to a certain part of your business model. In the case of SumUp, maybe it creates more transactions. In the case of when I was at Jimdo and working on their online store, it was more like leads to more signups because we were predominantly SaaS monetized at the time. So there's definitely differing context for what that could be, but it's just ship it as early as possible and get the key metrics you need out, both in the like long-term, a long-term one being more like, hey, are we getting churn because of this? You might not see that right away, but it can take effect, 6 months later, depending on the contract deals you have.
What's something you used to believe about leading teams, but you change your mind about that later?
Interesting. I think I've changed my thinking about what the ideal team is. And I think, I don't know, in the micro way, I change everything a lot about my thoughts on leadership. So let me explain the first thought of like the size of teams. Back in the day when I started leadership, I was also reading all the stuff by Will Larson, where, his whole perspective was 6 to 8 was the ideal software team. You can get collaboration and, effective like complexity there. And I think this is true, especially if you're working on something sufficiently new and innovative, which I think everyone wants to think everything they're working on is to some degree innovative, but in reality, that's not always true. I've seen a lot of engineers do really effective things on relatively small groups of people. Like, you have 2-3 engineers and 1 part-time leader. Because you end up with such a tight-knit group of people, then you really empower people to push forward things that they believe in. You sort of have, yes, a high level of responsibility on each individual, but this just really tight collaboration that reduces the friction that happens in even a mid-sized team like 6 to 8. So that's kind of been a recent change in the last few years.
And what's something you stopped doing that made your team stronger?
I think I have tried to actually, and maybe this conflicts with my earlier messages. Earlier on as a leader, I was pretty hands-on and I was pretty direct. I think like as you move up in the chain, like people who move up in the chain, I guess at some point, I guess I had the criticism of some point of being too opinionated and maybe occasionally not drowning out other voices, but being sort of the strongest voice in the room. And I have tried to take a step back and not always jump in with my thoughts, let people work out their thoughts. Now, this is a bit of a come and go because I think like some people just have communication styles that lead to like unhealthy communication dynamics. And unhealthy communication doesn't just mean, you're being kind of a jerk. It can mean communication where you're, in the radical candor sense, maybe like ruinously empathetic. You're talking too much, trying to like understand everyone all the time. It just leads to no results. So you kind of have to cut in sometimes. But I think over the years, I have taken a step back insofar as really pushing people and tried to instead like really have this direct communication in one-on-ones and say, hey, I would like to see you more doing this direct communication here. Jump in there and say this kind of thing because I knew you had this idea at this time. Not jump in place of people and say the thing that I think someone else is capable of doing.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I have one last question, and this is, again, maybe we hear it a lot, but I'm going to mention it, AI. What does that mean for engineer leaders, for engineer managers, for tech leads? What's the role it plays, AI, in their roles? Does it going to affect more the roles of individual contributors or the job of leaders, or is going to make it better for them or not? What are your thoughts on that?
So when I talk to my engineers, and this is maybe contrary to what this podcast goal is, I do tell them, don't focus on the goal of becoming a manager right now. And what I mean by this is like, if you get a role as a manager, that's fine, take it. But I think the core competency we need to always respect as engineers, whether we're leaders or ICs, is the engineering part. And I think even with AI, the engineering is still relevant. As it gets better and better, I do think a lot of like we're structuring some communication stuff, which historically is a big part of the manager's job, will become easier. And people can probably do that level of abstraction with less amounts of people. We've also seen this, like in recent years. I mean, heck, when I was at Shopify, they basically laid off, I think, most of the managers in Europe because they were trying to flatten their hierarchy, basically. And I do think most organizations will go towards flatter organizations with more people executing and less people sort of in the middle, which I think makes some sense. I mean, you can obviously overcorrect on this, and most probably will to a degree, but I don't think AI is going to be something that will make there be more plentiful managers. I do think it'll make the manager's job easier in the sense that, over time, organizations might start to ask for things like, I don't know, performance reviews, things like, project briefs to be somewhat generative, which is like this stuff can be time consuming to structure and make there in a clean way. And instead, if it's going to be focused more on like people actually getting those data points and inputs to what these things are, like the meat of it rather than the structuring of the content, which means you have to be closer to the problem.
So you think the engineer is going to be able to skip the engineer manager or the manager's role because they will be able to have this level of abstraction with the leverage of AI in their day work? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I think there will still be managers. I just think they probably will manage more people and with a different form. We're hearing a lot of stories, and I'm currently in a situation where you have managers that have 10 plus reports, which again, previously was sort of considered to be too much for one person to handle the context. And yes, in some cases, I do think a team can, and I know this, in fact, like teams can function purely fine with a few engineers and a tech lead, let's say, who takes some managing responsibilities. I think in a lot of contexts, in a lot of ways, engineering management will be shrinking as a field, or at the very least, like not growing. Because I do think the industry, despite the fact we're sort of slowing, will continue to grow, but it's like the proportion, like the percent of each role will shift more in the IC direction. We might see more staff engineers than we would EMs, for example. Or you'll have EMs who the title says they have hands-on again. It's just like a different interpretation of the role.
It's true, because it's always the question like what is the difference between, for example, a tech lead and an engineer manager? Sometimes it's like the tech lead has more hands-on role and the engineer manager has less hands-on work. With all of these tools, and we're moving too fast, teams are becoming more efficient. Maybe the role of engineer manager becomes more as a staff engineer, more hands-on on the work with the abilities of people management. More work, but with the leverage of AI, you can still handle it.
Yes.
David Lamothe, has been a great conversation, and I really enjoyed this. This is the first episode. David Lamothe, thanks for coming.
Thanks, Luis. Happy to be here.